The wind howled over the dry wasteland, carrying dust and silence across the barren ground. David sat alone in his small shelter, eating cold beans from a can. The old solar lamp flickered beside him, barely lighting the dark corners of the metal walls. He hadn't seen another soul in days, and he liked it that way. After everything he'd lost, loneliness was safer than hope. But tonight was different. A sound broke through the stillness. At first, he thought it was the wind again. But no, there it was, clear and sharp, a cry. Not the howl of a beast, not the hiss of wind. It sounded like a voice, a child's cry, full of pain and fear. David stood up, grabbed his flashlight and a long metal pipe, his only weapon. He stepped outside into the cold night, his boots crunching over cracked dirt and stone. He scanned the area, heart beating faster. Another cry came. This one weaker. It was coming from behind a fallen ridge near the edge of the dried-up riverbed. He moved quickly, carefully, crouching low as he followed the sound. Then he saw them. A figure lay in the dust, a strange tall creature with dark purple skin and silver hair. Beside her, curled up like a tiny ball, was a child. The woman wasn't moving. Blood on her arm and leg. The child was crying, clutching the woman's torn cloak. David froze, unsure what to do. They weren't human, that much was clear. He'd heard stories about alien refugees hiding in the wastelands. Most were harmless, running from war or slavery. But still, was this a trap? The child looked up at him with glowing violet eyes. Her face was dirty, her lips cracked, and tears streamed down her cheeks. She didn't say anything, but her eyes begged him to help. David swallowed hard, lowered the pipe, and stepped closer. The alien woman stirred, letting out a weak groan. She opened her eyes slowly, then tried to shield her child with her body. "Easy," David said softly, kneeling near them. "I'm not here to hurt you." Of course she didn't understand his words, but something in his voice made her stop struggling. She looked into his eyes, her breath shallow and fast. Then she whispered one word, barely audible, "Please." David didn't waste another second. He scooped up the child gently, then lifted the woman over his shoulder with great effort. She was lighter than he expected, almost too light. They hadn't eaten in days, maybe more. He carried them back to his shelter, his muscles burning, but he didn't stop inside. He laid the woman on his only mattress and wrapped the child in a blanket. He poured a bit of clean water into a cup and helped the girl drink. She was shaking, but her crying had stopped. The woman moaned in pain, trying to rise, but David placed a hand on her shoulder. "Rest," he said. "You're safe here." He looked at the wound on her leg, deep, infected, ugly. He had no real medical gear, just old cloth, alcohol wipes, and hope. He cleaned the wound the best he could, wrapping it tightly. The woman winced but didn't cry out. She watched him with wide, wary eyes. The child sat beside her mother, holding her hand tightly. She kept looking at David, not with fear, but with curiosity. David tried to smile, though his heart felt heavy. These two didn't belong here. But neither did he. Maybe that's why he couldn't turn his back. Hours passed. The wind outside grew stronger, but inside the small shelter, there was silence. The woman had fallen asleep, her chest rising and falling slowly. The child leaned against her, eyes half closed. David sat across the room, watching them, protecting them. He didn't know what tomorrow would bring. He didn't know who these two were or what trouble might follow them. But one thing was clear. He couldn't leave them out there to die. Not again, not like his own family. As the solar lamp flickered and the room dimmed into shadows, David whispered to the dark, "You're not alone anymore." Asterisk. The old shelter groaned in the cold wind as David sat awake, watching the two aliens sleep under the patched blanket. He hadn't meant to get involved, hadn't planned on carrying strangers into his lonely life. But the child's cries still echoed in his ears, and the way the mother had whispered, "Please," stayed heavy in his chest. The little girl stirred first, her eyes blinking open slowly. She looked around the room, then at her sleeping mother, then at David. He smiled softly and lifted his hands to show peace. To his surprise, the girl didn't shrink away. Instead, she tilted her head like she was trying to figure him out. David reached for the water bottle and poured a bit into a clean lid. He slid it toward her, careful not to move too fast. She hesitated, then crawled forward and drank it slowly, her small hands shaking. She was still afraid, but not frozen, not running. That was something. The alien mother shifted, groaning as pain jolted her body awake. David moved quickly, helping her sit up. Her breathing was shallow, and her face was pale. She looked at her child, then at David, her lips tight with worry. He shook his head gently, signaling everything was okay. She didn't speak this time, just nodded weakly. Outside, the sun began to rise over the dead hills, casting orange light through the cracks in the metal walls. David stood and went to the corner where he kept his supplies. Not much was left: some dried fruit, 2 cans of soup, and 1 small pouch of ration powder. He opened one can, heated it over a small flame, and placed it on a piece of cloth near the bed. The smell made the child's eyes light up. They ate together, in silence. The woman took slow, careful sips, pausing often. The child ate faster, hungrily, but always glanced at her mother first before each bite. David noticed the way they leaned into each other, how close they were. He wondered how long they'd been running. Later, he tried to clean the wound again. The mother winced but let him do it. She grabbed a piece of cloth and bit down as he tightened the bandage. The child held her hand the whole time, whispering something in her alien tongue. David sat back, wiping sweat from his brow. He looked at the alien mother, then pointed to himself and said, "David." He repeated it again. Slowly, she stared at him. Then, after a long pause, tapped her chest and said a soft word. It sounded like Asha. David smiled, then pointed at the child. Asha said another word, shorter and gentle. Lena. So now they had names: David, Asha, and Lena. A strange family, if only for a while. The sun was fully up now, but David's mind stayed clouded. He couldn't stop thinking about the wound on Asha's leg. If infection spread, if fever came, he'd have nothing left to fight it. His old medkit was long gone, used up years ago. He walked outside, scanned the dry horizon, and thought about the nearest outpost. 3 days' walk from here. Maybe more. Too far to leave them alone. Too dangerous to carry Asha that distance. They were stuck. When he returned, Lena was sitting near the broken window, watching birds fly in the distance. Her tiny fingers moved like she was drawing in the air. David sat beside her, unsure what to say. She turned to him, stared at his face, then suddenly placed her hand over his heart. He blinked, surprised. She didn't speak, but the gesture said everything. He wasn't just a stranger anymore. He was someone who stayed, someone who didn't turn away. Night returned, faster than expected, and the cold came with it. David gave them his old coat and wrapped himself in an extra blanket. Lena curled up between her mother and David's coat. Asha's hand rested protectively on her daughter's back, even in sleep. David leaned against the wall and closed his eyes. His body was tired, but his thoughts refused to rest. He didn't know what was coming or who might be searching for them, but he did know one thing for sure. He wouldn't let them die out here, not while he still had breath in his body and in the quiet. Just before sleep claimed him, he thought. He heard it again, a sound outside, soft, distant, moving closer. Something had found them. The sound returned just before sunrise. It wasn't the wind this time. It was soft, but not natural, too steady, too sharp. David opened his eyes slowly, his hand already reaching for the pipe beside him. He didn't move right away, just listened. Outside the shelter, something walked past the outer wall. It stepped lightly, but with purpose. Lena was still asleep, holding Asha's hand in a tight grip. Asha's eyes were half open, alert but silent. She had heard it too. David crept to the door and pressed his back against it. He held his breath, counting the seconds. Then something brushed against the outer metal sheet. It was close, so close he could hear its breathing. Suddenly, a loud snap broke the silence. One of David's wire traps had caught something. There was a cry, not human, high and painful. David rushed outside with his weapon raised, heart racing. A shape thrashed in the sand near the ridge tall, thin, with strange armor and long claws. An alien, not like Asha, but from the same world. The intruders struggled in the trap. Hissing in pain, David approached slowly, keeping the weapon aimed. At its chest, its eyes were yellow, glowing faintly in the dim morning light. Then it spoke guttural, sharp sounds, but one word stood out: Asha, back inside. Asha tried to stand when she heard the voice. She grabbed the doorway, her leg trembling under her. Lena tried to stop her, but Asha pushed forward. When she saw the alien caught in the wire, she froze. David looked back at her, confused. "A friend of yours?" he asked, knowing she wouldn't understand. But her face gave the answer. She stepped forward and pointed to the symbol on the intruder's chest, 3 black lines crossed by a red slash. She spat on the ground and said something low, angry. David understood then. This wasn't a rescue. It was a tracker, a hunter, sent to bring her back. Asha limped forward, pulled something from beneath her torn belt, a small, sharp blade made of bone. David blocked her gently, shaking his head. He didn't want more blood, not in front of the child. Instead, he cut the wire trap loose, letting the intruder fall hard to the ground. The alien growled, then reached for something in its cloak. David kicked it away and held the weapon closer. The intruder froze, realizing David would not hesitate. Then it said a word David didn't know, but Asha's face went pale. She dropped her knife and backed away. Lena ran to her and hugged her leg tightly, sensing her fear. David stepped between them and the intruder, his eyes cold. He pointed to the open desert and growled. "Go." The alien stared at him, then slowly rose to its feet. It limped away without another word, leaving strange marks in the sand. David watched until it disappeared into the hills. Back inside, Asha sat quietly, holding her child. Her hands trembled, not from pain but something deeper. David knelt beside her and waited, not speaking. After a long moment, she reached into her cloak and pulled out a small metal tag. It matched the mark on the hunter's chest. She handed it to David with shaking fingers. He looked at it, then at her. She nodded once, firmly. He understood, without another word. He stepped outside, threw the tag on the ground, and crushed it under his boot. Then he lit a small fire and dropped the pieces into it. Watching the flames rise, when he came back inside, Asha looked at him differently. There was something new. In her eyes, something deeper than thanks. It was trust. Lena ran to him and held his hand, her small fingers warm against his. He looked down at her, then at Asha, and nodded. Whatever danger followed them, it was his now too. Whatever fear they carried, he would carry it with them. He didn't know why this felt right, but for the first time in years, he didn't feel empty. And as night fell once more, and the stars returned to the sky, David sat at the door with his weapon in hand. He didn't sleep. He watched, and he waited, not for danger, but for a sign that tomorrow might be safer than today. The sun hadn't even risen when David felt something cold press against his throat. His eyes snapped open, breath frozen in his chest. A long metallic blade was held steady by a trembling hand. The alien man he'd spared was back, crouched over him with rage burning in his yellow eyes. David didn't move, didn't blink. He could hear Lena whimpering behind him and Asha's voice, a desperate whisper in her alien tongue. The hunter said something sharp, cruel, his voice cracking with pain and fury. Then Asha spoke back, louder this time, not weak, not afraid, but firm, like a warning. David had never heard that tone from her before. It wasn't the voice of a runaway. It was the voice of someone who had once led, once commanded. The hunter growled low in his throat, eyes darting between Asha and the child. Lena crawled to her mother, but Asha pushed her behind gently and stepped forward. She was still weak, still limping, but there was strength in her stare. She held out her hand and said one word, short but full of fire. The hunter stared at her hand, then dropped the blade and fell to one knee. David grabbed the knife quickly, heart still pounding. He wanted to strike, to end the threat, but he paused, because Asha was no longer looking at the hunter. She was looking at him. She didn't nod, didn't smile, but something passed between them in that moment. A silent message, "Trust me." David backed away slowly, still holding the blade. The hunter muttered something under his breath, stood up, and dropped a strange round object on the ground. It shimmered with light, humming softly, before David could speak. The hunter turned and vanished into the rocks once again, leaving only dust behind him. Lena ran to the device and touched it before David could stop her. A clear image rose from the surface, holographic, sharp, and terrifying. It showed a tall alien in royal clothing, barking commands. Behind her, chained and kneeling, were others like Asha, some wounded, some lifeless. Asha looked away, breathing hard. David turned off the device, his hands shaking. He finally understood. She hadn't just escaped hunters. She had escaped owners. That man wasn't chasing her for reward. He was chasing her for revenge, because Asha had broken their chain, and maybe others had followed her. David went outside and hurled the device far into the canyon, listening to it shatter against the rocks. When he returned, Asha was sitting alone, her head bowed. Lena was drawing in the dirt with her fingers, her face blank. He sat down beside Asha and spoke. "You were important once," he said quietly. "I can see it now." Asha didn't answer, but she lifted her eyes, and for the first time, David saw tears in them. Not fear, not sadness, shame. He wanted to say something more, something that would make it better, but instead, he took her hand and just sat with her. Sometimes, silence was the only thing strong enough to hold broken people together. That night, David opened the old storage room behind the shelter. He started gathering supplies, wood, metal, parts he hadn't touched in years. He began building something stronger, something with walls and locks and warmth. Asha helped, even when it hurt her leg. She handed him tools, learned quickly, even smiled once. Lena laughed softly when David made a hammer slip and nearly hit his own foot. For a moment, just a moment, they felt like a real family. But in the distance, a light blinked on the far mountain ridge. Then another, and another. 3 points of red light watching from the dark. They hadn't given up. Others were still searching, and now they knew where to look. The first thing David did the next morning was burn down his own shelter. The fire rose fast, swallowing the old walls and roof like dry paper. Smoke curled into the sky, black and sharp against the pale blue morning. It was loud, final, and necessary. Asha stood beside him, silent but understanding. She didn't ask why, because she already knew. The red lights from the mountain meant this place was no longer safe. They couldn't stay here, not if they wanted to live. Lena held David's hand tightly as they walked away from the flames. She looked back once, her eyes wide and sad. That small place had been their first roof, the first warmth, but now it was gone, and the only thing left was each other. For days they traveled, moving through dry valleys and cracked hills. Asha still limped, but she never asked to stop. She carried her child on her back. When Lena grew tired, David led the way, always scanning the horizon, his pipe now replaced with a makeshift rifle strapped across his back. On the 4th day, they found it. A half-buried cabin built into the rocks, hidden by vines and thyme. David had passed it once years ago, but never thought it could be useful. Now it felt like a gift, waiting quietly for them inside. The air smelled of old dust and rusted metal. The roof leaked in 2 places, and the floor creaked with every step. But it had thick stone walls, a back exit, and silence. That was enough. They cleaned it slowly, little by little. Asha helped as much as her leg would allow, and David reinforced the entrance. He used old solar plates from his backpack and set up a panel on the roof. By the 3rd day, they had working light and a small heater. Lena laughed when the light flickered on for the first time. She clapped her hands and hugged David tightly. He didn't know what to say, so he just patted her head gently. He wasn't her father, but she looked at him like he was something close. Asha watched from the corner, her eyes softer than before. Sometimes she touched her necklace and looked away. David never asked what the necklace meant. He figured she'd tell him when she was ready. One evening, as the wind howled outside, Asha brought out something strange. It was a small cube, black with glowing blue lines across its surface. She pressed her fingers against it, and suddenly a map appeared in the air, floating. David leaned closer, stunned. It was a map of her world and his, combined together. She pointed at a symbol marked deep in the outer wastelands, far from any town. Then she tapped her chest and looked at David. Her meaning was clear. They're still hunting. That symbol was a gathering point, a place where the slavers met. She wanted to go there someday, to end them, but not now. Not yet. For now, survival came first. David nodded slowly and turned off the map. He placed the cube in a steel box and buried it under the floorboards, just in case. Each day, their bond grew stronger. Not with words, but with actions. Asha began to laugh, sometimes quiet and short, but real. Lena started speaking broken English words, copying David. Safe, she said one night, pointing to the walls. Home, she added, smiling. David felt something break and rebuild inside his chest, a feeling he thought had died long ago. He didn't just care about them, he needed them. One night, while checking traps around the cabin, he spotted something, a strange metal object, half buried under the dirt, blinking faintly. He picked it up carefully, eyes narrowing. It was a tracking beacon, still active. David crushed it under a rock and walked back with a storm brewing behind his eyes. Someone had been close, too close. He didn't say anything to Asha or Lena, but that night, he didn't sleep. He just sat by the door, weapon ready, listening to the wind and waiting for the next shadow to move. The message came in fire, not in words, not through a voice, but as a sudden burst of light on the edge of the sky, followed by a deep boom that shook the earth beneath the cabin. David ran outside, rifle in hand. He looked toward the hills where the sound came from. There, a thick black pillar of smoke rose into the air, twisting like a finger pointing straight at them. Asha joined him moments later, holding Lena close. Her eyes narrowed when she saw the smoke. She didn't speak, but she didn't have to. She knew what it meant, and so did David. Someone had arrived, and they wanted to be seen. That night, a low humming echoed across the valley. It wasn't wind, and it wasn't natural. A sound like a machine breathing, slow and heavy. David peeked out through the cracks in the cabin wall. Red lights moved across the rocks in the distance. 2, then 4, then 6. Not scouts, not wanderers. A search party. Inside, Asha placed a small pack beside Lena, filled with a few items: water, dried food, and a strange glowing stone. David watched her carefully. She wasn't scared, not like before. She was preparing to run. No, David said firmly, his voice low. You're not leaving again. Asha looked at him with tired eyes and placed a hand over her chest. She pointed to Lena, then to the forest behind the hills. David understood. If she stayed, Lena could escape. If she ran, they might both get caught. David shook his head. This is my home too now, he said. If we run, we keep running forever. Asha didn't answer, but she didn't argue. She sat down beside him and placed her hand on his arm. That was enough. The next morning, a voice called from the valley. It came from a machine, a flying drone that hovered in the air. The voice spoke in broken English, harsh and loud. Return the escaped property, and you will be spared. Lena flinched at the word, property. David's jaw tightened. He stepped outside and raised his rifle toward the drone. I don't trade family, he said coldly. The drone paused, as if processing the response. Then it flew away without another word. Later, as the sun began to fall behind the cliffs, they came, figures in dark armor, 6 in total. Their footsteps were heavy, and their eyes glowed behind their helmets. David stood by the cabin door with Asha beside him. She held a weapon of her own. Now an old alien blade, she'd repaired herself. Lena stayed inside, hidden behind a wall, holding the small stone tight in her hands. The soldiers didn't speak. They raised their weapons and began to move forward. David fired first, hitting the ground near their feet. "A warning, leave now," he said, "or this ends in blood." The lead soldier stepped forward, ignoring the shot. Asha growled something in her own language and threw her blade. It struck one of them in the leg, causing him to fall hard. Gunfire lit the air, sparks flying from metal and stone. David ducked behind the doorway. Heart pounding, Asha grabbed the second blade and ran into the dust, vanishing like a shadow. She was faster than they expected. Stronger than they remembered, she moved through the chaos with skill cutting one. Disarming another, David backed her up, hitting a target that tried to flank her. When it was over, 4 of the soldiers were down. 2 had fled into the hills, leaving trails of smoke behind them. The air was thick with dust and the scent of metal. David stood still, breathing hard, blood on his arm but alive. Asha returned slowly, limping, her blade dripping red. She didn't smile, she didn't cheer. She only looked at David and then at the cabin where Lena waited. They had won the fight, but the war was far from over that night. David sat with Asha and Lena by the fire inside their home. He wrapped his bleeding arm with cloth, and Asha pressed the glowing stone gently against it. It hummed, and the pain faded. Lena rested her head on David's lap and whispered a word he didn't know. He looked at Asha, confused. She smiled faintly and translated with one word, "Father." David looked down at Lena, stunned. His hands shook slightly as he touched her hair. Something deep in his chest ached, but it wasn't pain. It was warmth, family, not by blood, but by choice. And David had chosen them. Snow began to fall, slowly at first, then heavier. It was the first snow Lena had ever seen. She pressed her hands against the cabin window, watching the white flakes melt on the cold glass. Her eyes lit up, wonder replacing fear for the first time in months. David sat by the fire, sharpening a new blade he had made from alien steel. His injured arm had healed mostly, though the scar would stay forever. Asha sat across from him, stitching a cloak from pieces of fabric she'd gathered. She looked up at him every few minutes, not to speak, just to make sure he was still there. No more red lights had appeared since the attack. The last 2 soldiers had not returned. Maybe they were dead, or maybe they had reported what they saw. A human who fought like he belonged to no one. David had reinforced the cabin's walls, added traps in the forest, even hidden an escape tunnel under the floor. But days passed, then weeks, and no one came. One evening, as snow piled high outside, Asha placed something small in David's hand. It was her necklace, the one she always touched when she was afraid. David looked at it closely, an old carved stone, warm to the touch despite the cold air. He tried to give it back, but she closed his fingers around it and shook her head. She spoke a word softly, the same one Lena had used, family. David couldn't speak, his throat tightened. His heart felt too full, so he just nodded. That night, they shared the last of the fruit they had saved for winter. Lena giggled when David told a simple human story about a snowman who could talk. Asha didn't understand every word, but she laughed anyway. It was real. Soft laughter, the kind that only came from deep peace. The next morning, David woke to silence, the kind of silence that felt strange, too perfect. He stepped outside and saw something new. A craft had landed in the valley, but not like the others. This one was old, rusted, unarmed, and standing in front of it were beings unlike any he'd seen. Refugees, worn and quiet, mothers, fathers, children, just like Asha and Lena. One of them held a flag made of torn fabric. It was white, marked with a black circle, Asha's old crest. She stepped beside David, her eyes wide in shock. David looked at her, then back at the group, and he understood. They hadn't come for war. They had come for hope. News had spread of what happened, of a woman who escaped, of a child who survived, and of a human who fought for them. They had come to find a place where no one would own them. David opened the gate without a word. Asha stepped forward, holding Lena's hand, and for the first time, she walked without a limp. They welcomed the others in, helped build fires, shared what little food they had left. The small cabin turned into a gathering place, filled with voices, warmth, and the sound of life returning. Lena played in the snow with another child who had lost their voice but smiled with their eyes. Asha sat near the fire and told quiet stories in her language. And David stood at the doorway, watching it all. He didn't ask for this, didn't expect it, but somehow, without planning, he had become the protector of more than just one mother and child. He had become their guardian, their family, and as the sun rose through the snowy trees, lighting the valley in gold, David finally allowed himself to believe something he hadn't in a long time, that maybe this wasn't the end of the world, maybe this was the beginning.